Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tea and Books. Things look a little bit different if you're used to seeing the comfy chair behind me. Today I'm in my office from work instead, so I'm not at home in the comfy chair. And that's sad, but hopefully everything will still go okay in this new environment. And hopefully soon, if things go well, we'll all be together in person again. And won't that be nice after all this time? So welcome to Tea and Books. Today I'm going to be talking about 3 different books. 2 are fiction and 1 is nonfiction. So the 2 fiction books I'm going to talk about today are Yours Cheerfully by A.J. Pierce, A Net for Small Fishes by Lucy Jago, and Troy, the Greek Myths Reimagined by Stephen Fry. So those are the 3 I'm going to talk about today, just to get ready for it. And the first one I'm going to start off with is Yours Cheerfully. So I don't know, for those of you who are regular Tea and Books watchers, you have probably heard us talk about the first book in this series, which was Dear Mrs. Bird. So the author is A.J. Pierce. So Dear Mrs. Bird was a delightful book, and I'm sure that anybody that read it felt the same. It's about a wonderful character, Emmy Lake, who is working for a woman's magazine during World War II in London, England. And she very much wants to be a war correspondent, but is starting off working at this ladies' magazine instead. So this is the second book, Yours Cheerfully by A.J. Pierce. So anybody who read Dear Mrs. Bird, this is the second book, same characters, so you'll enjoy the follow-up. Those of you who haven't read Dear Mrs. Bird, you can probably still read this without reading Dear Mrs. Bird, because it does sort of press a little bit of what happened in Dear Mrs. Bird in the part that I'm going to read at the beginning. Spoiler alert, I guess. But for those of you who haven't read Dear Mrs. Bird, I'm sure you would still enjoy it. But the thing that makes this book, I think, a great read right now is that even though it's set during the Second World War and it very much does deal with wartime, it really embodies that sort of keep calm, carry on, cheerful, gung-ho attitude. And Emmy herself is just so much fun. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from the very beginning, the prologue of the book that sort of sets it up, just so you can get a feel for how much fun it is to read and how delightful the characters are. London, late May 1941. As Mr. Collins called a start to the Women's Friend editorial meeting, to anyone watching, it was a perfectly normal Monday morning affair. Kathleen had handed out the agenda. Each member of the staff had a folder full of their notes, and, as usual, Mrs. Bustle had brought teas up to the 5th floor despite the stairs playing havoc with her unpredictable leg. "Might I ask why you are all staring?" said Mr. Collins. He looked down at his waistcoat. "Do I have something on my tie? I haven't seen a fried egg in weeks." The entire Women's Friend team burst into applause. "Congratulations," said Kathleen and I at the same time. "Hurrah!" cried Mr. Newton, as if Hitler had just taken a knock. Mr. Collins continued to look baffled. "Hello?" he said, as if he were struggling with a disappointing telephone connection. Mrs. Mahoney patted his arm fondly. "Well done," she said. "We're all ever so pleased." "Lovely news," said Mr. Brand in his quiet voice. Mr. Collins looked none the wiser. "About becoming our new editor," I prompted. "Oh, that," he said, looking embarrassed. "Well, yes, thank you, everyone. Bit of a turn-up. Didn't think it was my bag." "Now you're just being daft," said Mrs. Mahoney. "With respect," she added quickly, remembering Mr. Collins' new, very senior role. "None indeed," he replied quite happily. "Nothing will change. Mrs. Bird was hardly ever in the office, so you probably won't notice a difference." On the other hand, I hope perhaps some. He paused and gave me a look. It was only the 3rd day of my probation, after all. So far, so good, he smiled. Plenty of time for catastrophe, of course. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Newton, I was only joking. Mr. Newton, our advertising manager, had gone pale. He was very good at his job, but did tend to look on the disastrous side of life. I felt myself flush. My first 6 months in magazine publishing had not gone entirely to plan due to what my mother had called some unfortunate hiccups that couldn't be helped. It was very nice of her to put it that way, but not wholly true, as my father had remarked at the time. I don't wish to be unkind, Elizabeth, he'd said to her, but I think Mrs. Bird could be of the opinion that the unfortunate hiccup might have actually been Emmy herself. He did have a point. Mrs. Henrietta Bird had been Women's Friend's longest-serving agony aunt and acting editress, and part of my job as the new junior had been to open readers' letters so that she could answer their problems. It had sounded straightforward enough, but I had struggled to come to terms with Mrs. Bird's approach to giving advice, which was slightly in the manner of Attila the Hun. It didn't matter that since the start of the war, many of our readers had been through the most dreadful times. Kindness was rarely her first port of call. It was fair to say that Mrs. Bird and I had not exactly got on. Mrs. Collins, on the other hand, had been terrifically decent all round, and I was delighted he would now be in charge. "Thank you for your kind words," he said. "While I promise I will do my very best to give the editor job a good bash, I'm afraid we do have a slight problem now that Mrs. Bird has left us to join Livestock and Pet." The celebratory atmosphere disappeared in a flash. The threat of a blank page was unthinkable, but Mr. Collins was reassuringly calm. "Clearly," he continued, "we need a new Henrietta Helps. I realize it is urgent, but perhaps we should take the opportunity to try to find someone who doesn't actively terrify the readers." Everyone nodded their heads. I said absolutely, and Kathleen joined in with "too right," and then Mr. Newton used the moment to say, "There is a war on," in a grave voice as if some of us had not yet cottoned on. "I've looked at trying to take someone from one of the other magazines," said Mr. Collins, "but frankly, we can't afford them. So I'd like to know who you think could do the job. Perhaps one of our existing contributors? Nurse Maclay, for example." Nurse Maclay was in charge of the Women's Friend's Mother and Baby Club and took a similar approach to Mrs. Bird, only with a syringe. "She's awfully busy with her baby advice," said Kathleen. "And she puts the fear of God into the mothers," said Mrs. Mahoney, less diplomatically. Kath nodded. "That's true," she said. "Nurse Maclay once told me that after the age of 5, people are either quite sensible or absolute idiots. If you haven't sorted them out by then, there's nothing more you can do about it, so you might as well just leave them by the side of the road." "Good grief," said Mr. Collins. "Perhaps Livestock and Pet could do with a nurse." "Mrs. Croft is very nice," said Mr. Brand of our cookery editor, "although what's in the hot pot does take up her time." "And her husband's not well," said Kath, "so she's struggling as it is." "Oh, we certainly don't want to add to that," said Mr. Collins. For someone who always said he understood books far better than people, he was secretly enormously sympathetic at heart. "I'm sure we can find a new advice lady," said Mrs. Mahoney, who was in charge of production and known for her practical bent. "It's not hard if you know what you're doing. A bit of guidance and some sympathy, and most people will cheer up." She looked around the table. "You could do it yourself, Mr. Collins, except for the fact you're a man." "Ah," said Mr. Collins, taking the blow in his stride. "I do apologize, Mrs. Mahoney. It is a failing we must all try to bear." Mrs. Mahoney gave him an understanding look. "It's not your fault," she said generously, as if there were a possibility it could be. "Women are just better at being helpful, that's all. Look at Hitler. No help to anyone outside of himself. I'd like to see him raise 4 daughters all on his own and make sure they're happily married to good sorts. That'd shut him up." So you can see that the characters in Yours Cheerfully are delightful. They're very funny. They're very upbeat. They have a very practical and sensible attitude towards the war. They've been working in it for a bit now, and it's a very interesting thing to be sort of inside a women's magazine from that time, with all of the discussion of, you know, trying to do a fashion page telling people how to use their coupons and how to wear a hat 10 ways and all of these interesting ideas. And so if you haven't read Mrs. Bird, I would recommend reading both, really. But this book on its own is delightful. It's a very uplifting story, and it just is full of those, like I say, those lovable characters. And just at a time like this, it is, I think, a delightful read. So once again, that was Yours Cheerfully by A.J. Pierce, and I would really recommend it. Another new book that you may or may not have heard of, but which I particularly enjoyed, is A Net for Small Fishes by Lucy Jago. So this book, I think, is particularly probably going to be interesting to people who really enjoyed Wolf Hall and Hilary Mantel's other books. It's a historical book. It's set under King James, but it's a very interesting because it's talking about true life events that happened in this friendship between a doctor's wife and Frances Howard under King James. And these women were accused of a murder actually of murdering somebody who was being held in the Tower, as it happens. So this is one person's background of what might actually have occurred outside of the historical information that we have on what did occur. And like I say, it's very much written in that beautiful style with lots of historical detail, very, very rich. You really feel that you're in it. Very beautifully written. And I found the characters interesting. The main character in particular, the doctor's wife, is very interesting because she actually was one of the first women to hold a patent. And the patent that she held was for a yellow starch that she made to dye ruffs this saffron yellow, because she was very interested in fashion, but she also did a little bit of sort of mixing up drugs and stuff to help her husband. So she had a very interesting life, this woman. So it makes for a very interesting background to the whole story. So I'm going to read you a bit about this. There's a lot of description in it, so I apologize in advance if it takes a while to get to some action, but I find the description beautiful. The servant led the way as if into battle, his torch throwing monstrous shadows of my form against the walls. Fog muffled the light and dewed the stone, although mid-morning the place felt to be just waking. As we threaded our way through a maze of passages, the cries of a woman disturbed the torpid peace. The servant sped up. It troubled me that we charged toward the sounds of anguish. I confess, so that you hold no illusion of me, I have never learned to govern most of my faults, nor even tried very hard, especially those of ambition, curiosity, and pride. A godly woman would have run from that place as if from the maw of hell. Everyone knows that the jeweled facades of courtiers thinly veil their greedy, scurrilous, vain, lascivious souls. Me? I rushed in. Crossing an inner courtyard, we passed a fountain on which figures in pale marble wrestled, their naked limbs frosted by the English winter. The water at their feet was stopped, and a stench rose from the puddle in its scalloped bowl, yellow with the piss of noblemen and their dogs. Even the places these people relieved themselves were not ordinary. We arrived on the third floor of a building against the Thames and entered a large apartment. Here the crying was loud enough to be described as wailing without risk of exaggeration, although the people standing in the entrance hall ignored it. I twisted my head about like a pigeon. Every surface glowed with polish, tapestry, or gilt. The air itself perfumed with such exotic scents that my nose was as greedy as my eyes for the extravagance with which I was enveloped. A tall gentleman tried to attract the servants' attention. He accompanied a man clutching a drawing board, a painter, I assumed, but the servant ignored them, and I was chivied through a series of magnificent rooms, glinting even in the dull January light. Too soon we reached a door upon which he knocked and gave me a look that said, "God's blessings, you'll need them," and fled. The door was unlatched, and an old eye looked at me blankly through the crack. "I am Mistress Anne Turner, wife of Dr. Turner," I announced over the noise from within. "I have been summoned." The servant opened the door on a scene fit for the globe. 100 candles illuminated the tableau of a woman, a girl really, on her knees and sobbing. Long chestnut hair swung about her blotchy face, giving the appearance of a lunatic, an impression heightened by the undershirt slipping off her shoulders, kept up by nothing but a black armband. In one hand she clutched a string of pearls, while the other was buried in the silken pelt of a small white dog that whined each time she howled. The chamber appeared to have been ransacked. The contents of a sewing box were strewn upon the floor among shoes, undershirts, bird droppings, and a little pile of dry dog turds. From the bed canopy swung a green parrot, and circling like distressed mayflies were 3 maids, the ancient one who had opened the door, and 2 very young ones holding lace-edged handkerchiefs, hairbrushes, and wine. As another of my faults is not to know my place as well as I should, I stepped forward. "My lady," I said with a deep curtsy, for this unhappy creature was the Countess of Essex, Frances Howard. She was wife to an earl, daughter to an earl, great-niece to an earl, and lady-in-waiting, second rank, to the Queen. The Howards were as close to the king as his own family. Oftentimes they appeared more favored. I had not seen Frances in the 3 years since her wedding, nor had I ever known her intimately, but we were acquainted, both our families being Catholic and living within a short distance of each other in the country near Saffron Walden. "My husband is Dr. Turner, your husband's physician?" She gave no indication of having heard me. Slowly, however, after much hiccuping and sniffing, her crying subsided. The silence that ensued was not of the peaceful kind. No one moved. The fire did not spit. All eyes were on the bowed figure. Even her dog gazed into her face with concern. As her stillness became unbearable, she extended an arm. Without hesitation, the maid with the cup stepped forward and placed it in the girl's outstretched fingers. She drained it and sat back on her heels. With eyes closed, she pushed the hair back from her damp face. Only then did she look at me. Although her cheeks were mottled with crying, I still received a little shock from her beauty. Her hair and eyes were a lustrous brown, and her skin, as if laid on cream, not flesh, was that which comes only from dining on the food of princes. Life was coiled tight within her, and it sparked in me a moment of envy, for I had borne 6 children, and sometimes endured days in which I yawned more than I spoke. There seemed no point in asking how she did, so I repeated my name and explained that I had received a note that morning from her mother. She scowled and opened her mouth to comment, but at that very moment, the lady of whom we spoke, the Countess of Suffolk, sailed into the room like a ship fully rigged in court dress, every inch swinging with pearls and gold chains. Behind her came her other 2 daughters, one older, one younger than Frances, sumptuously apparelled but plain by comparison to their sister. They came to a halt, skirts swaying on willow hoops as wide as their arm spans, a priceless armada. The little dog shot under Frances's undershirt. "Do I look like a kennel, Brutus?" Frances said. A sty, exclaimed her mother. In the fingers of one hand she was rolling what looked like an owl pellet. Why are you not ready? What is this, She gazed around her daughter's chamber as if a stranger to it. Under Queen Elizabeth, when she was not yet a countess, she had not the nerve to develop strange tics, but the fortunes of her family had soared with the arrival of King James, and she adorned her new status with a variety of affectations, the most annoying of which was the rising at the end of her pronouncements. Perhaps she thought it fashionably French, or was it to disguise her guileless intellect? The achievement of her vaulting ambition had been entirely due to a generous dowry, uncommon comeliness, and the fortunate quality of having no scruples. I have known her all my life, for my mother was in her acquaintance, and remained so even after she sacrificed her position to marry my father. So lean is society in the countryside that the Countess would have had no company at all if she had been too strictly observant of rank. I cannot hear you. I crave your blessing, muttered her daughter. Why is Larkin out there? He is meant to be taking your likeness, said her mother, rather foolishly, I thought. No portrait I had seen took distress as its subject. Your father is furious. When you feel sorry for yourself, remember he was already widowed by your age, as was I. Think of your family, even if you cannot please yourself with your match. We must marry our daughters before they marry themselves, he always says, and he is right, especially in your case. And the Countess, slapping the back of her hand against the girl's forehead, peering at her as one might an animal with a leg missing. You are not feverish. Stand up. Turn around. Her daughter rose, flinching as if wasps stung her, and swiveled on unsteady feet. As she turned, her back was revealed through a rip in her undershirt, from collar to coccyx. The skin was slit all over with bleeding welts. I could feel the burning pain in those lashes, and the hair on my forearms pricked in shock and pity for this girl. How furious her mother would be at the damage inflicted on her beautiful child. Yet there was no cry of horror, not even a gasp. To protect one's child is the first compulsion of any parent. To determine cause and fault follows later. Not, it seemed, with Frances's mother. Her sisters also stood mute. Why are you still not dressed, said the Countess, her face glistening, hard as a sugar sculpture. She turned to me. Every time we met, she affected barely to know me unless we were alone. I've heard you are talented with apparel, she said. I curtsied, but said nothing, unsure what the statement insinuated. You have come to help my daughter dress. It was not a question. I cannot dress, mumbled Frances. Her mother stepped forward, I thought, to hold her, but instead she put ringed fingers under her daughter's chin and forced the girl to look at her. Was she envious? The Earl of Suffolk was known to favor Frances above his other children, perhaps above his wife too. Did he whisper in the girl's ear that she understood him best? I have seen daughters thus favored become unhappy wives when they cannot bewitch their spouses as they did their fathers. If you do not attend today, your husband will send you to his estate at Chartley, she said, as if to a half-wit. It is far away and comfortless. He will keep you there, whipping you without cease, if he wishes, until you submit to your marriage as your sisters have done to theirs. I sensed the distance between myself and Frances Howard contract, and wanted to take her in my arms. It is a hard fate to have a cruel husband. He was barely 17 and already pitiless. You will feel better when you look better, said the older sister Elizabeth, not kindly. Do you? Asked Frances. The sister flushed. Your self-interest reflects badly upon us all. You have not even the hardest of it. Frances only shrugged. Her mother put the white object she had been pinching into Frances's hand and tugged her daughter's shift into place as if it were a presentable thing not ripped and bloodied by her son-in-law. Please see that she is dressed by midday, she said, neither looking at me nor making clear how she intended to make my intervention worthwhile. She left, trailed by her more tractable daughters. So that sort of gives you an idea of the opening scene when Frances meets Anne Turner, and you see how their friendship begins. But as I said, it's a very interesting story, and to see how that moves from a friendship that ended up, historically speaking, with both of them being investigated for murdering a man in the tower. Get the book and read it. It's fascinating and very well written. And the last book that I am going to talk about today is the third book in Stephen Fry's Mythos series. So if you haven't already been reading this series, and you're a fan of Greek mythology, I would really recommend it. It's Stephen Fry. The first book was Mythos. The second book was Heroes. And this book is just Troy. So it's all mythology relating to the Battle of Troy. And I personally have always loved Greek myths since I was little. So I've been reading all these books and listening to them on audiobook as they come out. And it's just delightful. Because it's Stephen Fry, who of course is a famous comedian as well as actor, you can certainly get a lighter feeling for it, and there's some humor as well, so I really recommend it. So I'm going to read a little bit about it from the story of Paris, which is one part of the book. On the slopes of Mount Ida, Paris grew into a beautiful and highly intelligent boy, youth, and young man. No herdsman fought better to protect his livestock, or indeed his father and fellow pastoralists. No calves, lambs, or kids fell to the wolves and bears when he was in charge. No poachers or bandits dared trespass on his pastures. Among the people of the area, he earned another name, Alexander, or Defender of Men. Before long, Paris met and fell in love with the Oread, or mountain nymph, Winone, a daughter of the river god Cerbren. They married, and a I've never seen that word before, paradisal idyll seemed destined for the pair. Paris's passions in life were simple and few. The beautiful Winone and the welfare of the flocks and herds he looked after for his father, as he thought, Aglaeus. He was especially proud of the bull of his herd, a huge white animal with perfectly symmetrical horns and the most marvelous thick and curly forelocks. You, he told the bull, fondly slapping its flank, are the best bull in the whole world. If I ever saw a finer, I swear I would bow down and crown it with gold. Even the gods don't have a bull as beautiful as you. Now it so happened that the god Ares, who had a great fondness for Troy and its people, overheard this boast and told Hermes about it. Foolish mortal, he thinks his bull is more beautiful than any one of ours. Oh, said Hermes, I sense a lark. A lark? Said Ares. A jest, a jape, a joke. All you have to do is turn yourself into a bull and let me do the rest. Hermes explained the outline of his prank, and a smile spread over the war god's face. That'll teach the brat, he said, and he set about his transformation. Ares had no time for shepherds and agriculturalists. They lazed in fields when they could be fighting and killing. At that moment, on the grassy lower slopes of Mount Ida, Paris was indeed lazing in a field. He was, in fact, fast asleep. A shadow falling over his face woke him. He looked up and saw a young herdsman gazing down, eyes twinkling. Can I help you? Paris, isn't it? Said that herdsman. That's right. And who might you be? Oh, just a humble drover of cattle. I hear you have a prize bull that you believe to be matchless. That I know to be matchless, said Paris. I even heard it said that you will crown with gold any beast that's finer. I did say that as it happens, Paris admitted, puzzled, but I didn't know anyone was listening. Oh, well, if you didn't mean it. The herdsman turned to go. I meant it, said Paris. Stay where you are, and I'll fetch mine, said the herdsman. I think you might regret your boast. Hermes, for it was of course he, went down and drove his bull up the hill to Paris, deriving great pleasure from slapping its rump and flicking its back with a switch, not something any Olympian would normally dare to do to the combative and short-tempered god of war. The instant Paris saw Ares the bull, he conceded that this beast was broader, whiter, finer, and altogether more handsome than even his own prize animal. I can't believe it, he said, marveling at the thick coat and shining horns. I thought mine could never be beaten, but this fellow. He fell to the ground and began gathering all the celandines, aconites, and buttercups he could find in the grass. My crown of gold is nothing more than a wreath of yellow flowers, he said to Hermes, arranging a garland around the horns. But give me time to make my fortune, and I will find you and reward you with real gold. No need, said Hermes, putting his hand on Paris's shoulder and smiling. Your honesty is reward enough. It is a rare and beautiful thing, even rarer and more beautiful than my bull. Time passed, and beyond mentioning in passing to Oenone the remarkable beauty of the strange bull as an example of how there are more wonders in the world than can be found on the slopes of a mountain, Paris thought no more of this incident. He was most surprised, therefore, to be woken from a pleasant sleep one afternoon not long afterward by a shadow once more falling over him, and for the shadow, after he had sat up and peered with shaded eyes against the sun, again to reveal itself to be that of the young drover. Oh dear, said Paris, I hope you have not come for your gold crown already. No, no, said Hermes, I have come for something else. I bring a message from my father Zeus, who calls upon you to do him a great service. Paris knelt in wonder. He saw now, how had he not noticed it the first time, that the young man's face shone like that of no mortal. And how could he have missed the live snakes that writhed about his herdsman's staff, or the wings that fluttered on his sandals? This could only be Hermes, messenger of the gods. What can I, a poor herdsman and shepherd of the fields, do for the King of Heaven? You can get up off your knees for a start, Paris, and come with me. Paris scrambled to his feet and followed Hermes through to a sparsely wooded copse. The god pointed to a clearing dappled with patches of sunlight, where Paris could make out 3 shining female forms. He knew at once that these were immortals. Great immortals. Goddesses. Olympian goddesses. He stood transfixed, trying to speak, but all he could do was drop to his knees. He does that, said Hermes. Up, Paris. Your honesty and unclouded judgment have been noted. We have need of them now. Take this apple. See those words inscribed on it? I can't make out those marks, said Paris, flushing. I never learned. Not to worry. It says, to the fairest. It is for you to decide which of these 3 is worthy to receive it. But I'm just a... My father wishes it. Hermes was still smiling, but something in his tone of voice made it clear that he would countenance no denial. Paris took the apple in trembling hands. He looked at the 3 female figures. Never had he seen such loveliness in all his life. His Oenone was beautiful, the daughter of an immortal herself. He had thought no beauty could ever match hers, but then he had thought the same of his bull. The first goddess stepped forward. He knew from the purple silk, the peacock feathers lining her headdress, the fine cheekbones, the grandeur, and the proud majesty that this could only be Hera, the queen of heaven herself. Give me the apple, said Hera, coming close and gazing deep into Paris's eyes, and power and sovereignty over all people shall be yours. Kingdoms and provinces across the wide world shall come under your rule. Imperial sway, riches, and dominion such as have been given to no mortal. Your name will ring down in history. Emperor Paris, respected, honored, and beloved of all, obeyed by all. Paris was ready to put the apple straight into her outstretched palm, so clearly was hers the prize. Her beauty filled him with awe and reverence, and the reward she offered would give him everything he had ever dreamed of and more. He had always felt, somewhere deep inside, that he was destined for greatness, for power and fame. Hera would give it to him. The apple must go to her. But then he realized that he had to be fair and allow the two other goddesses to at least make their claims, absurd as they would certainly be beside those of the Queen of Heaven. Paris looked toward the second goddess, who was now coming toward him, a grave smile playing on her lips. In the very surface of the shield she bore, by some artifice he could not understand, he could make out the furious and frightened scowl of Medusa. This aegis alone told him that the goddess now before him was Pallas Athena, and her words confirmed his conviction. "Present me with the apple, Paris, and I shall give you something more than powers and principalities. I offer you wisdom. With wisdom comes everything else, riches and might if you choose, peace and happiness if you choose. You will see into the hearts of men and women, into the darkest corners of the cosmos, and even into the ways of the immortals. Wisdom will earn you a name that can never perish from the earth. When all the citadels and palaces of the powerful have crumbled into dust, your knowledge and mastery of the arts of war, peace, and the thought itself will elevate the name of Paris higher than the stars. The power of the mind shatters the mightiest spear." Well, thank goodness he didn't give the apple straight to Hera, Paris thought, for here is the prize above all prizes. She is right. Of course she is right. Wisdom first, and power and wealth will surely follow. Besides, what use is power without insight and intelligence? The apple must go to Athena. He stopped himself from giving it to her when he remembered that there was one more contender for the prize to be heard. The third apparition stepped forward, and her head tilted demurely down. "I cannot offer you wisdom or power," she said in a soft voice. She lifted her face, and Paris was dazzled by the sight. Never had such transcendent radiance met his eyes. "My name is Aphrodite," said the vision, looking shyly up at him from under her lashes. "I am not wise or clever, I'm afraid. I cannot win you gold or glory. My only realm is love. Love, it seems so small next to empires of the land and sea or empires of the mind, doesn't it? Yet, I think you might agree that so insignificant and silly a thing as love, why do we need it after all, might be worth considering. My offer to you is this." She was holding a scallop shell, which she passed to him. When he hesitated, she nodded encouragement. "Take it and open it, Paris." He did so, and inside the shell, moving and alive, there shone the shimmering image of the most entrancing, captivating, enthralling, and bewitching face he had ever seen. It was the face of a young woman. Even as he stared into the shell, she raised her chin and seemed to look directly into his eyes. She smiled, and Paris almost lost his balance. Flames leapt to his cheeks. His heart, throat, head, and stomach pounded so hard he thought he might burst apart. The sight of Aphrodite was astounding, but it almost hurt his eyes, and he had wanted to look away. The face inside the shell made him want to dive inside. Who? Was all he could say. "Her name is Helen," said Aphrodite. "If the apple is mine, she will be yours. I will dedicate my life to ensuring that you are together. I will protect you both and defend your union always. This is my oath to you, and it cannot be broken." Without a moment's thought, Paris pushed the apple into Aphrodite's hands. "The prize is yours," he said hoarsely, and turning to the others, added, "I'm sorry. I hope you understand." But Hera and Athena, the one scowling, the other shaking her head in sorrow, had risen up into the air and were now vanishing from sight. When Paris turned to thank Aphrodite, he saw she too had gone. There was no scallop shell in his hands. He was not standing. He was lying in the grass, the sun scorching his cheeks. Had it all been nothing but an afternoon dream? But that face, who the world was Helen? So there you go. That is Paris's story, and we all know about Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. So as I've said, this was from Stephen Fry's book Troy, the third book in his Mythos series. So if instead of fiction you would like to read something that's technically nonfiction but actually just mythology, so another type of fiction, I would certainly recommend any book in that series. So just to recap, the other books I talked about were A Net for Small Fishes by Lucy Jago and Yours Cheerfully by A.J. Pierce. Thank you all very much. I hope you have a pleasant day and rest of the month, and we'll see you next month for Tea and Books, and we'll see if it's still online at that time. Everything's changing so quickly right now. Thank you very much, everyone.